Don't listen to the twins. That's the only sentence scribbled on the last page of Pastor William Phillips's journal, written in a shaking hand hours before he was found hanging from the rafters of Pine Hollow Church. No suicide note, no sign of struggle. Just that line, ink soaked into old parchment, as if he'd written it in desperation. A warning, or maybe a confession. But by then it was too late. The Morrison twins had already vanished into history. Two 9-year-old girls who, in the winter of 1834, arrived in a forgotten Kentucky settlement and unraveled a tapestry of lies that even God seemed to look away from. No one remembers where they went. No graves, no records, no descendants. Just whispers, passed from father to son, elder to initiate, about what they knew, what they saw, and what they revealed that should have stayed buried. You're not supposed to know this story, not because it's hidden, but because it's dangerous. Because once you hear what the twins revealed, you won't be able to forget it. You won't sleep the same. You won't walk into a church, a courtroom, a school, or a government office without wondering who's hiding what and how deep the rot really goes. This isn't folklore. It's not fiction. It's a documented, verifiable event pulled from the recovered writings of a 19th century Baptist pastor, buried for 150 years behind the pulpit of a church no longer marked on maps. A story sealed away because it exposes something more than paranormal mystery. It opens the door to an ancient pattern, one that threads through every religious structure, every institution of power, every carefully arranged society where obedience is prized and questioning punished. This video is not entertainment. It's a key. And once you take it, once you turn the lock, you don't go back. If you're still here, it means something in you already knows. Already feels it. That gnawing tension between the world you were taught to trust and the one that exists behind the veil. Don't say I didn't warn you. The twins didn't just see secrets, they awakened them. And what they uncovered in Pine Hollow will either destroy your illusions or awaken your soul. Let's begin. Pine Hollow wasn't on any major trail. You didn't stumble into it. You had to be led. Built into the folds of Kentucky's eastern hills, it was a pocket of silence, a place where trees grew thick, roads faded fast, and the only sound at night was wind moving like breath through hollow timber. The settlement was established in 1818 by 3 families fleeing doctrinal disputes in nearby Lexington. They didn't just want to escape religious conflict. They wanted to control the faith themselves. They built a church before they built homes. A square structure of pine and stone, simple from the outside, but different inside. The altar faced north, not east. The cross above it was carved from an ash tree, the same one local Cherokee tribes once warned settlers never to cut. And beneath that altar, unknown to the congregation for years, was a cavity in the floor, a cavity the Morrison twins identified within minutes of arriving. That's how it always started, not with fire or prophecy or thunder in the skies, but with a quiet remark, a knowing glance, a dream retold with impossible detail. Pastor William Phillips recorded it all. He'd been educated, read Greek and Hebrew, trained in the systems of logic, but nothing in his theological schooling prepared him for 2 children describing, in perfect sequence, events he had never spoken aloud. Events he had buried deep beneath robes of ritual and scripture. A bottle, a cloth, a grave mistake. The Morrison family arrived November 15, 1834. A man and his daughters traveling by foot across the mountain circuit. Ezekiel Morrison, 34 years old. Tall, gaunt, with a Bible in one hand and something far heavier in the other. The burden of knowing his daughters weren't normal. Rebecca and Rachel, identical twins born during a blizzard that buried their home under 2 feet of snow and claimed their mother's life in the process. They entered the world covered in blood, screaming in harmony, and according to Ezekiel, they hadn't stopped revealing things since. At first he thought it was coincidence, Then, intuition. But when they spoke of things no child could possibly know, names, dates, hidden sins, Ezekiel began keeping a journal. Not of sermons, but of patterns. Patterns that emerged in every town they visited. Because wherever the twins went, secrets surfaced, and institutions broke. They say children don't lie well. But that wasn't the problem with the Morrison twins. The problem was that they didn't lie at all. Every word they spoke, no matter how implausible, no matter how damning, turned out to be true. And that's what made them dangerous. Not to individuals, but to structures, to systems, to illusions carefully crafted over generations. You see, Pine Hollow wasn't just a village. It was a controlled environment, a prototype, a community engineered to test how deeply religious obedience could override truth. Its founders, the Holloways, the Whitfields, and the Merricks, didn't just leave Lexington because of doctrine. They were involved in a schism over the use of discernment sessions. Secret meetings where sins were exposed not through confession, but by hierarchical decree. The church elders claimed divine insight, but in truth, it was social manipulation, a controlled unmasking of the weak to consolidate the power of the few. By 1834, that system had been fully installed in Pine Hollow. Pastor Phillips, though an outsider, was brought in to maintain order, to document births and deaths, and to gently suppress unrest. And he did, until the twins arrived. The first crack appeared during dinner their first night. Rebecca casually asked Mrs. Phillips about the roses that had nearly died 3 summers ago. A small detail, but one the woman had never spoken of publicly. Her reaction, pale, shaking, spoon dropped, told everyone at the table it was more than coincidence. Then came the morning dream and the floorboard bottle. By Sunday, the twins weren't simply observing. They were pulling threads, calling out lies one by one. To Samuel Turner, the respected landowner, Rebecca gently revealed the exact sum he had skimmed from the church plate. To Martha Whitfield, the moral judge of the town, Rachel whispered the truth about her missing husband. But it wasn't vengeance. It wasn't cruelty. It was exposure, delivered with unsettling calm, like a mirror held to the soul, but polished too perfectly. So perfectly that no one could deny what they saw. And something deeper began to stir. Not fear, not yet, but panic. Because the congregation realized something they hadn't considered. The girls weren't guessing. They were remembering. By the end of that Sunday service, Pine Hollow was no longer a sanctuary. It was a powder keg. And the Morrison twins had lit the fuse. They didn't scream. They didn't threaten. They simply spoke, with a softness that struck harder than any shout. It was Rachel who delivered the final blow that morning, quietly, clearly, standing in front of the altar like a child playing pretend. Only this wasn't a game. The Whitman family didn't die in a house fire, she said. They died right here, and some of you know why. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was surgical. Like every man, woman, and child in that church had just been cut open and realized they were bleeding. The Whitmans, the untouchable tragedy of Pine Hollow. Officially, they perished in 1818, the same year the town was founded. A fire, a storm, a heartbreak no one questioned. Jacob and Mary Whitman, pillars of the community. Their daughters, Hope and Faith, were said to be angels. Everyone mourned. Everyone moved on. Except they didn't. Because not all wounds scab. Some ferment beneath the surface. And Rebecca, she didn't stop there. She described the twin girls in detail, the location of their birthmarks, the doll one carried, the locket the other wore, what they were wearing the night they died. Facts not recorded anywhere. Facts only someone present would know. And that's when the elders began to sweat. not metaphorically, literally. Beads of moisture on foreheads, pale faces, trembling hands. Because the moment Rebecca spoke of the silver locket, they knew someone in that room had seen the truth, had buried it, in silence, in lies, in ritual. The congregation cracked. Whispers hissed like steam from boiling water. Eyes darted. Some wept, some prayed. Some stared at the girls with a mixture of awe and dread, as if realizing for the first time that maybe God didn't speak from pulpits, but from children who knew too much. Pastor Phillips tried to intervene, but his voice died in his throat. He wasn't in control anymore. The church wasn't in control. The truth was, and truth, real truth, has a hunger. It doesn't just want to be known. It wants to be reckoned with. There are places in this world where truth isn't just unwelcome. It's lethal. Pine Hollow was one of those places. What happened next wasn't chaos. It was collapse, the quiet kind, the kind that institutions fear the most. Not riots, not fire, not blood, but recognition. A moment where masks slide off, not ripped, but simply fall. And what's left is the face beneath. And what they saw that Sunday, in themselves, in each other, was rot. The Morrison twins didn't expose evil. They exposed agreement, complicity, silent pacts made across pews and dinner tables behind doors and inside prayers. Because the truth is, the Whitmans weren't killed by strangers, and the church wasn't just a church. It was a stage. Elder Thompson stood up first. His body shook, not from age, but from something deeper, memory resurfacing. He didn't deny what the girls said. He just asked how they knew. Rebecca answered by describing a locked drawer in his cabin, the one with a silver comb, a strand of hair still caught in the teeth. "You kept it," she said gently. "You didn't want to, but you couldn't throw it away." His wife collapsed in sobs. That comb had belonged to Faith Whitman. Then Rachel stepped forward. She pointed toward the back wall of the church, the panel that creaked louder than the others. "They tried to hide in here," she said, "but someone found them. And when they screamed, no one came." The air felt different after that. Dense, charged, like the space between lightning and thunder. Mrs. Carter whispered about bloodstains that never washed out. Old Benjamin Foster mentioned bones found in the mortar of the eastern wall. And Dr. Hayes, the one exposed earlier for his lack of training, spoke with an unsettling calm. "They weren't buried in the cemetery," he said. "They are the church." That was the moment Ezekiel stepped in. His voice, rarely heard that day, cut through the rising terror like a blade. "Now you see," he said. "My daughters do not choose what they see. The past chooses them." Then he looked at Pastor Phillips. "And sometimes, Reverend, the past chooses where to return." There was no more denial, only reckoning. That night, no one in Pine Hollow slept. Some prayed, some packed, some stared into the woods as if expecting justice to crawl out of the dark wearing the face of two little girls. But most simply sat in silence, hands trembling, minds unraveling. Because when foundations crack, the walls don't just fall, the ceiling comes down with them. Pastor Phillips remained in the church long after the last congregant had fled. He stood alone, staring at the altar, his mind a battlefield. What he'd heard, what he'd seen, had not just shaken his faith. It had shattered the architecture of his entire life. He had been taught to believe that God spoke through order, through hierarchy, through scripture. But now, he had spoken through children, and not in parable, in precision. And it terrified him. The floorboard bottle, the blue blanket, the private sin no man had known. How could they have known? How could God have allowed it? But that was the wrong question. Because what was becoming clear was that God may not have been the one revealing these things at all. The twins said they saw the past. But how? They described the dead with the familiarity of family. Their dreams weren't symbolic. They were detailed transcripts, full names, locations, sensations. They didn't just speak of the Whitman girls. They channeled them. And this wasn't the first time. Ezekiel had tried to ignore the pattern for years, tried to call it spiritual intuition, but something inside him had shifted the night Rachel, age 5, described in perfect clarity a hanging that had occurred in a Mississippi parish 40 years before. She even knew the name of the man who cut the rope afterward, a name that didn't exist in any written record, but was confirmed years later when old church ledgers were uncovered during renovations. That was the moment he stopped calling it a gift and started calling it what it was, a debt. Because every revelation had a price, every truth unburied, every secret named, left the twins a little more hollow, as if the dead weren't just speaking through them, but into them, consuming, replacing. That's when Ezekiel began writing everything down. Because if something ever went wrong, someone had to know the pattern. By Monday morning, Pine Hollow wasn't just unraveling. It was haunted. Not by ghosts, by memory. The kind of memory that doesn't fade, because it was never yours to begin with, but was passed down person to person like a contaminated heirloom. The kind that changes how you see your neighbors. The kind that makes you question whether God ever really lived here at all, or if he left long ago and something else moved in. The Morrison twins didn't speak again that night. They sat silently in the guest cabin, hands clasped, eyes unfocused, like radios tuned to frequencies no one else could hear. Pastor Phillips watched from a distance. He didn't sleep. He couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the locket, the hair comb, the blood that never cleaned. But most of all, he saw Rebecca's face when she said, "They want someone to remember." It didn't feel like possession. It felt like duty, like the girls weren't haunted. They were chosen, not blessed, used. And that made him ask a question he'd never dared voice before. What if not every spirit seeks justice? What if some seek replication? Ezekiel sat by the fire, journal in hand, his pen moving without pause. He was recording everything, not as a preacher, but as a witness. And what he wrote that night may be the most disturbing passage in all his entries. I used to believe the girls were touched by heaven. Now I believe they are burdened by something older, older than scripture, older than mercy, a voice that whispers not in words, but in reminders. They don't prophesy, they replay, and what they replay always demands a consequence. That line hit Phillips harder than any sermon ever had. Because he suddenly understood. The girls weren't revealing secrets randomly. They were uncovering specific truths, long-buried lies that allowed a system of false purity to survive. The secrets weren't accidents, they were the foundation. And when foundations crack, something has to replace them. That's when the dreams started to spread. Phillips's wife screamed in the middle of the night, said she saw twin girls standing at the end of the bed, said they weren't Rebecca and Rachel, said they were older, and smiling. By Tuesday morning, the infection had spread. Not like disease, like recognition. You could see it in the eyes of Pine Hollow's elders, in the tremor behind every voice, the sudden hush that fell when anyone mentioned the church. But the most telling sign was this. No one denied the twins anymore. Not even Samuel Turner, who had tried to laugh them off just days before. Because when fear like this settles into a community, denial isn't defense, it's a death wish. People weren't just frightened of the girls now. They were frightened of what the girls had made visible. It was as if the town had been living beneath a painted sky, and the twins had peeled it back, revealing a black, endless void filled not with spirits, but accounts, ledgers, balances long overdue. Every lie, every betrayal, every secret deal, struck in the dark, now stood tall in daylight. And it was Rachel who spoke next. In the middle of breakfast, she lifted her spoon, stared into her porridge like it was a scrying bowl, and said, "There's something under the church, something older than the walls." Ezekiel froze. He'd heard that sentence before. Not from Rachel, from Sarah, their mother, who, before she died, had muttered the same words feverishly as the twins entered the world. He had thought it was just delirium, a woman slipping between life and death. But now, he wasn't so sure. Rebecca added quietly, "It's watching now. It knows we're telling." Pastor Phillips didn't know whether to run or fall to his knees. He remembered the dreams that had started the night before, the noise in the attic, the smell of burned pine that had no source, the sound of a bell, soft, distant, wet, that had no bell tower to belong to. Whatever this was, it wasn't finished, because exposure wasn't the end. It was the beginning. What the twins had done was summon consequence. They had pulled history back into the present and given it a stage. And now, it was moving, breathing, choosing. Rachel looked at Phillips and whispered, "There's one more lie that hasn't come out yet." Then she tilted her head, like she was listening to something only she could hear, and smiled. There are smiles that comfort, and there are smiles that warn. Rachel's was the latter, the kind a child makes when they've just remembered something the adults hoped they'd never say out loud. Pastor Phillips knew it instantly, because behind that smile wasn't innocence. It was knowledge. The kind you don't find. The kind that finds you. Phillips excused himself from breakfast, but his hands shook. He climbed the slope behind the chapel where pine trees grew in unnatural symmetry, 13 of them, each planted with perfect spacing. He never thought much of them before. A curious pattern, maybe a founding family's tradition. But now, they felt like markers. Graves without names. He stood beneath the largest pine, the one that bent slightly north. And that's when it hit him. A memory he'd buried so deep it no longer felt like his own. 12 years earlier, when he had first arrived in Pine Hollow, Elder Merrick had asked for his help with a midnight errand. No explanation, no questions, just a shovel and silence. They had dug until dawn. Merrick never said a word, just pointed. A shape wrapped in burlap. No ceremony, no scripture. Phillips helped, too afraid to ask, too eager to belong. He told himself it was a sick animal, but it had teeth like a child. And now, 12 years later, the memory surfaced like bile in the back of his throat. Rebecca and Rachel hadn't revealed that secret yet, but they didn't need to. Because the power of the girls wasn't just what they said, it was what they made others remember. Secrets didn't stay buried around them. They rose like corpses in spring thaw, wet, heavy, undeniable. By mid-afternoon, the church doors were locked. The congregation had splintered. Some left town. Others gathered in tight circles, whispering about cleansing rituals, exorcisms, or whether the girls were witches in disguise. But the oldest residents didn't speak at all. They just stared at the woods. Because they remembered the Whitman girls, not as victims, but as warnings. And they remembered what happened when truth tried to take root in Pine Hollow the first time. Back then, it was fire. This time, it felt like something worse. By the time dusk bled across the hills, Pine Hollow had fractured. Not in chaos, in ritual. People weren't arguing, they were preparing. as if some unspoken consensus had been reached. The twins weren't just children, they were vessels, and whatever moved through them now, it wasn't going to leave peacefully. Mrs. Whitfield was the first to suggest it aloud. "They're conduits," she whispered during the emergency gathering in the chapel basement. "What they see, it's not theirs, it's ours. All of it, coming back through them like smoke through cracks." No one corrected her, because deep down, they all knew. Rebecca and Rachel weren't broken. The town was. The twins were just the reflection, polished too clearly for anyone to lie to themselves anymore. And reflections demand recognition. That night, Pastor Phillips sat alone in the sanctuary, candle lit, Bible open, but the word felt thin now, fragile, like a curtain fluttering before something far more ancient. He turned to Ezekiel. "What are they?" Ezekiel didn't answer immediately. His fingers traced the leather of his journal like a priest reading a relic. "I used to ask that," he said finally. "Used to beg God for clarity. But then I realized something." He turned and looked Phillips in the eye. "They're not here to answer questions. They're here to ask them." Phillips felt it in his spine. The power of that truth. Because in every town they visited, the pattern repeated, not once, every time. The girls arrived, secrets emerged, hidden crimes clawed their way to the surface, the towns resisted. And then, something changed. Not in the girls, in the place itself. As if the soil absorbed the confessions, as if the buildings leaned closer, as if the air thickened with memory until it pressed down on everyone like a second skin. Rachel stepped into the sanctuary. She walked barefoot to the pulp, yet no sound, no preamble, and said just one thing: "It's time for the last lie." No one moved. Rebecca followed behind her, carrying something wrapped in cloth. She unwrapped it slowly, reverently. It was a silver locket, the one Hope Whitman wore the night she died, the one no one had seen for 16 years. Except someone had kept it. Someone in that room. There are objects that carry memory, and then there are objects that carry judgment. The silver locket in Rebecca's hands wasn't just an heirloom. It was evidence, the kind that doesn't need a jury, the kind that doesn't accuse with words but with presence. Pastor Phillips felt it instantly, not just in his mind, in his blood. A coldness, heavy, ancient, as if the locket itself remembered being torn from Hope Whitman's neck, as if it still held the final echo of her breath. Elder Thompson stood slowly. His face was hollow. Decades of power, of respect, of spiritual authority, gone, replaced by the look of a man who had finally lost a war with himself. He stared at the twins, not with anger, not with fear, with recognition. "I buried it," he said, voice dry as dust, "beneath the church. I thought it would stay there." Rebecca shook her head slowly. "You didn't bury it. You planted it." The room froze. Because that was the difference, wasn't it? Burial is to forget. Planting is to return. The locket wasn't found by chance. It had emerged, like a root system, like something alive clawing back toward the surface. Not because it wanted justice, but because it wanted witness. Rachel stepped closer, her voice now calm, almost tender. "You told them it was for protection, that they had to stay hidden, even from their own mother." Thompson sank into the front pew. "No one was supposed to die," he whispered. Rebecca stared at him, her voice soft, almost merciful. "But someone always does." The congregation sat in silence, not a single denial, not a plea, not a word of comfort. Because what could you offer a man who'd spent half his life in church, only to realize the walls echoed with the screams of children he helped silence. Then Rachel looked directly at Pastor Phillips. "There's still one more," she said. "The last lie. The one you wrote in the margins. The thing you buried." Phillips went white. Because there was a letter, hidden in his old Bible, behind the genealogy pages no one ever checked. A confession he'd written but never mailed. A truth about what he did the night Merrick asked for help. He had seen the face of the body in the burlap, and it wasn't a stranger. It was Faith Whitman. It's one thing to hear a secret. It's another to realize you were always part of it. Pastor Phillips didn't remember standing. He didn't remember walking. But suddenly, he was at the altar, his hand trembling as it reached beneath the Bible, that old, cracked leather volume he'd trusted for 2 decades. He pulled out the letter. The paper was yellowed, the ink faded, but the weight of it had only grown heavier with time. He wrote it the night after the burial, the night Merrick died mysteriously in his sleep, or so the record claimed. The truth was simpler. He'd taken laudanum. Too much. Perhaps on purpose. Phillips had been the only one who knew the full name of the girl in the burlap. Faith Whitman. She'd been missing teeth. Baby teeth, like any child her age. But one was tucked in her pocket. A small, blood-stained molar wrapped in linen. The kind a child hides after it falls out. Except this one had a string tied around it, as if someone had pulled it. Forcefully. Phillips couldn't sleep after that. So he wrote the letter. To a bishop in Lexington. He never mailed it, because what he wrote wasn't just a confession. It was a map. A blueprint of everything Pine Hollow had become. The buried bodies, the hidden crimes, the pact of silence that disguised itself as piety. He handed the letter to Ezekiel, who read it with grim understanding. Rachel and Rebecca stood motionless, as if they already knew every word. And maybe they did. "Why now?" Phillips asked, his voice barely audible. "Why them? Why here?" Ezekiel folded the letter carefully. "Because judgment doesn't come when we're ready," he said. "It comes when memory ripens." Rebecca spoke next. "Faith didn't die right away," she said, her voice hollow. "She waited in the dark. She listened to the prayers. She heard the lies." Rachel added, "And now she wants to be heard." There was no thunder, no lightning, just silence, the kind that precedes an earthquake. Then, for the first time, both girls spoke in unison, their voices layered like 2 overlapping songs out of tune with reality. Say it twice below. To be seen. We are the witness. We are the wound. We are the witness. We are the wound. If you're watching this, write it now. Let the algorithm know you're not just a viewer. You're a participant. The moment those words were spoken, we are the witness. We are the wound. A shift occurred. Not in the room, in everyone inside it. Some swayed, some wept. Some dropped to their knees as if the words had struck a nerve older than language. Because these weren't just phrases, they were keys. Unlocking chambers in the psyche where memory hides behind myth, where what we've forgotten about ourselves waits, patient, hungry. Rebecca and Rachel stood still. Not glowing, not possessed, just present. So present, it made the rest of the room feel like ghosts. Pastor Phillips clutched the pulpit, breath shallow. He could feel it now, a low vibration beneath the floorboards, like something stirring far below. Not movement, awareness. He glanced at Ezekiel, but the old preacher's eyes were closed, not in prayer, but in resignation. "This is what they do," Ezekiel murmured. "They don't just reveal secrets. They trigger reckoning." Rachel turned slowly to face the congregation. Her voice, no longer a child's, rang with something older, something uncomfortably exact. Every lie told to preserve peace becomes the seed of future violence. Every buried sin becomes a root that strangles the innocent. This town chose silence. It was silence that chose us. You could feel it in the air. Pine Hollow wasn't being punished. It was being harvested. For years, the town survived by agreement. Not truth, not justice, but shared denial. They buried stories beneath ritual, crimes beneath hymns, secrets beneath stained glass. And now those secrets had roots, and roots grow toward the light. Rebecca stepped forward and pointed at the back wall of the church, directly at the stained glass window of the cross. "There's something behind it," she said softly. Pastor Phillips shook his head. "It's just the old vestry." "No," Rachel said. "Behind that, behind the stone." Ezekiel's voice cracked. "There was a room once, before the church." Phillips turned. "What do you mean before the church?" Ezekiel looked at him, haunted. "I mean, this building wasn't the first thing built on this land." And that's when it all came together. The fire, the dreams, the teeth, the locket. The twins weren't just revealing recent truths. They were digging down to the first lie, the one the town was built on. There is a lie so old, it becomes architecture. You don't see it anymore because you're standing on it. That's what Pine Hollow had become. Not a town, a structure built to contain a truth so volatile, so unbearable, that generations had agreed, silently, never to name it again. Until now. Pastor Phillips moved toward the stained glass window with reluctant purpose. The light from outside bled through crimson and gold as if the sun itself had been infected by the truth beneath. He reached behind the old vestry shelves and pressed against the wall. Hollow, stone, but not foundational. A facade. Ezekiel joined him, and together they found the seam, a hairline crack that ran vertical. Not natural, placed. It took 3 tools and nearly 20 minutes of scraping and silent dread before the stone gave way. Behind it, a door. Not wood, iron. And etched on its face was a symbol none of them recognized. A spiral made of intertwined thorns. The kind of symbol that doesn't mark entry. It marks containment. Rachel and Rebecca stepped back. Not in fear, in reverence. "This is where they kept it," Rachel whispered. Pastor Phillips turned. "Kept what?" Rebecca answered. "The reason the Whitman twins were hunted. Not because they were witches, not because they were cursed, but because they remembered something no one else was supposed to." The door moaned as it opened, metal groaning like a voice waking from 200 years of sleep. The air that spilled out wasn't dust, it was wrongness. Heavy, sweet, like rotting flowers left at a grave that didn't want to be remembered. Inside, stone steps, leading down, much deeper than any church should descend. The congregation stood frozen, but Ezekiel nodded once. "I've seen this before," he muttered, "in Tennessee, and in the hills outside Asheville." Phillips turned sharply. "What is it?" Ezekiel didn't answer directly. Instead, he said, "It's not just your town, Pastor. This is everywhere. Wherever churches were built atop something older, something that was never meant to be forgotten." Rachel stepped to the stairwell, her hand grazing the iron doorframe, and whispered, "This is where the covenant was broken." The steps were cold. Not with temperature, with memory. Each stone felt like it had absorbed centuries of breathless fear. And as Pastor Phillips descended first, candle in hand, the light seemed to bend, pulled inward, like something down there was hungry for illumination. Ezekiel followed. Then the twins. The others stayed behind. They didn't need to be told. This wasn't their descent. This was theirs. The ones marked, the ones chosen. the ones already tethered to whatever had been buried beneath Pine Hollow long before Scripture came to the hills. 30 steps. That's how far it went. 30, before the tunnel opened into a chamber that no town record had ever acknowledged. It wasn't just old, it was pre-language. The walls pulsed with carvings, not made by hands, but by repetition. Symbols etched by thought, not tool. Spirals, eyes, teeth, a star with no center. And all around, in a perfect circle, child-sized handprints, pressed in blood. Phillips nearly dropped the candle. Rebecca walked straight to the center of the chamber. There, in a depression in the stone, sat a bowl carved from obsidian. It reflected no flame, only you, and not as you were, but as something deeper, something watching from behind your eyes. Rachel reached into her dress and pulled out the locket. She didn't hesitate. She dropped it into the bowl. A sharp crack echoed through the chamber. Not stone, not metal, but something older than either. The sound of a seal giving way. Rebecca whispered, "The blood was never cleaned, only consecrated." Phillips stepped back. "What is this place?" Ezekiel's answer came slow. "It's a memory trap." Phillips turned. "What?" "A chamber built not to worship, but to store truth, the kind no man could carry without breaking." He gestured to the walls. "These handprints, they're not marks of ritual, they're witnesses. Every child who saw what they shouldn't left part of themselves here." Rachel looked up. They told the Whitman girls the bowl would forgive them, but it wasn't for forgiveness. It was for containment. Rebecca added, "The town needed a vessel for the memory, and when the girls wouldn't carry it alone, they became part of the bowl." Pastor Phillips stumbled back. Because in the black reflection of the obsidian, for the briefest moment, he saw two faces, not the twins, but two others. Mouths sewn shut, eyes open wide. The mind can break in silence, but it shatters in recognition. Pastor Phillips stood frozen, not from fear, but from truth overload. Because what he saw in that obsidian bowl wasn't metaphor. It wasn't symbol. It was proof of what Pine Hollow had done, of what he had inherited. The two faces in the bowl, stitched mouths, hollow eyes, weren't hallucinations. They were remnants, echoes of the original twin girls, Faith and Hope Whitman. Still trapped, still bearing the town's hidden sins like a scar that refused to fade. Rebecca knelt beside the bowl. Her hand hovered above it, but she did not touch. "Some memories," she said, "weren't meant to stay in human minds." Rachel stepped behind her sister. "And when a town forces children to carry the weight of its sins, that town forfeits its right to peace." Ezekiel's voice cracked like old wood. "They weren't just hunted. They were chosen." Phillips turned to him. "By who?" "By the ones who came before the church, before the town, before language. They needed vessels, and when the adults refused, the children bled." A soft wind swirled in the chamber, though no air should have moved. It carried something foul, like burned sugar and rotting feathers, the scent of rituals gone wrong, of innocence weaponized. Rebecca looked up at Phillips, and her voice was no longer a child's. "You lied in sermons to protect the myth. You looked away when the rituals were repeated. You let the blood dry, but you never wiped it clean." Phillips collapsed to his knees. His chest heaved, not from guilt, from the weight of sight, the realization that Pine Hollow wasn't cursed. It was maintained through silence, through sacrifice, through the burying of truth beneath symbols of salvation. Rachel pointed toward the far wall. There, behind a thin curtain of ivy and moss, was an ancient slab. Not wood, not stone. Bone, smoothed and polished like an altar, but warm to the touch, carved into its surface. Hundreds of names. Phillips approached slowly. He recognized none, until the final line. 2 names. Hope Whitman, Faith Whitman, and beneath them, recently etched, as if the altar had just accepted the offering, Rebecca Morrison, Rachel Morrison. Phillips spun around, but the girls were gone. There are disappearances, and then there are ascensions. Pastor Phillips called out into the blackness of the chamber. His voice echoed, hollow and unanswered. The twins were gone. Not fled, not hidden. Gone. Like breath dissipating from a mirror. Ezekiel remained still, his eyes closed. Not in grief, in acceptance. "They're not lost," he said softly. "They've been claimed." Phillips grabbed his arm. Claimed by what? Ezekiel looked up, and for the first time there was no mystery in his face. Just the weary clarity of a man who'd wandered too long through lands not marked on any map. "By memory," he said. "By the original witness." The obsidian bowl began to hum, low, subsonic, the kind of sound that isn't heard, only felt, in bone, in teeth, in the nerves behind the eyes. Phillips staggered back. Something behind the bowl pulsed, not light, consciousness. A presence rising, not into the room, but into the mind. It didn't demand worship. It didn't ask permission. It revealed. And suddenly, Phillips knew. This wasn't just a chamber. It was a womb, a vault built not to imprison darkness, but to incubate truth, the kind that burns through generations until it finds voices brave or broken enough to speak it. The Morrison twins hadn't been victims. They were midwives, delivering a knowledge the town refused to birth on its own. Rachel's voice returned first, not in the chamber, but in Philip's head, clear, calm, inescapable. "We weren't here to haunt you. We were here to fulfill a covenant your ancestors broke." Rebecca's followed, more fierce. "You built a church on top of the grave of the old god, and every Sunday you fed it denial. We are its memory. We are its return." The iron door at the top of the stairwell slammed shut. Above them, footsteps, panic, screams. The church was reacting. Not because of the girls, because the final truth had been named. Phillips turned to Ezekiel, trembling. "Can we stop it?" Ezekiel looked toward the altar of bone. "No," he said, "but we can choose how it remembers us." Then, a light from the altar. A pulse and a voice, ancient and made from many. "Choose." The voice didn't echo. It rooted, straight into the skull, into marrow, bypassing thought. It wasn't a voice made of sound. It was made of memory itself, compressed into vibration, the kind that reorders you from the inside out. Choose. The word was a command, but not one given from power, one given from inheritance, as if the moment was never meant for anyone else but you. Ezekiel stepped forward, and for the first time since arriving in Pine Hollow, he looked afraid, not of death, of being seen completely. He approached the altar, slowly, reverently, like a man walking into the judgment he'd been preaching about for 30 years. Pastor Phillips tried to stop him, but his feet refused to move. The chamber had made its choice. Ezekiel placed both hands on the bone altar, and when he spoke, his voice was not his own. "I offer no excuses, only witness." The altar pulsed, and across its surface, names began to glow. Not carved, summoned. Generations of secrets. The chain of silence. Every sin covered in the name of order. Every child punished for seeing what adults refused to admit. Every sermon that told people not to look. And then, 3 names at the center of it all. Jacob Whitman, Samuel Turner, William Phillips. Phillips collapsed. Because the system wasn't some abstract force. It had names, faces, men who told themselves they were doing God's work while feeding the hunger of the structure beneath them. And now, the structure wanted resolution. Rachel's voice returned, faint but resolute. You must decide how the memory ends. Not for you, for the next ones. The altar began to shift. The bowl of obsidian cracked open like an egg, and inside was something pulsing. Not light, not matter. A thought form, pure memory, unfiltered, raw. And Ezekiel reached into it, his face contorted, not in pain, but revelation. He saw every toe, every chamber, every faithful man who had traded truth for order, every twin born knowing too much, every time innocence was punished for clarity. Then he turned and held out the glowing memory to Phillips. Take it, he said. Let it know you. Phillips backed away. No, he whispered. I can't. I didn't. Ezekiel cut him off. It doesn't care what you did. It only cares what you do next. The memory hovered between them. Not heavy, not light, just true. And truth, when it is this pure, has a gravitational pull. Not on the body, but on the soul. Pastor Phillips felt it like a hook sliding under the skin of his identity, tugging at everything he had built, his sermons, his silence, his image. Let it know you, Ezekiel said again, quieter this time. Not as an order, as a final invitation. Phillips reached out. His hand trembled, not from fear, but from the knowing that the man who touched this memory could not remain the same. This wasn't forgiveness. This wasn't salvation. This was integration. His fingers met the light, and in an instant, his mind collapsed inward. It was like falling into a mirror that didn't reflect your face, but your lineage. He saw every version of himself, the boy who first lied in the name of decorum, the man who stood silent while others bled, the preacher who knew, deep down, something was wrong, but told himself God moves in mysterious ways. And then, a flash of the Whitman girls. They stood in the old church wide-eyed, holding hands as men argued over what to do with them. The girls weren't crying. They weren't screaming. They were remembering. Phillips saw the moment of their death. He felt it. But more than that, he saw what they saw in their final breath. A promise that someone would eventually see them. Not as ghosts, not as warnings, but as evidence. Of a system that feeds on those who see too much. A structure so afraid of the raw clarity of children that it built churches on their graves and called it redemption. Phillips let go of the memory. But it didn't let go of him. His hands glowed faintly, even in the darkness. His eyes had changed. The light wasn't in them. It was behind them, as if something ancient now watched the world through him. Ezekiel bowed his head. It's done, he said. Phillips turned to the altar, but the names were fading, receding back into bone, and in their place, one final inscription appeared. Not carved, not burned, but alive. Remember us, or become us. The church door above creaked open. They were being allowed to leave. But now, they carried something out with them. When they emerged from the chamber, the church had changed. Not in appearance, in atmosphere. The air was still. the pews untouched. But every shadow felt occupied. Every beam of sunlight through the stained glass windows shimmered like a signal, not from heaven, but from something older than heaven itself. The congregation was gone, not dead, dispersed, scattered like a ritual undone mid-incantation, as if their purpose had been served, and now they were no longer necessary. Ezekiel and Phillips stood at the altar in silence. The bowl was gone. The twins were gone. But something remained. Phillips reached into his coat pocket, searching for his sermon notes, the ones he had prepared that morning before everything changed. They were blank. Every page, not erased, emptied, as if the very ideas he once believed in had been extracted, scrubbed clean by a force that no longer tolerated delusion. Even memory was no longer his. He turned to Ezekiel. What happens now? Ezekiel looked out the window. The valley beyond Pine Hollow was calm. Deer moved through the mist like ghosts born from the land. No thunder, no lightning, just quiet reclamation. They've gone where they're needed next. The girls? No, Ezekiel said. The memory. Phillips sat down, slowly. The wooden pew beneath him creaked like it recognized him, but didn't forgive him. He looked around the church. Every familiar object felt alien. The pulpit he had stood behind for decades. The hymn books worn from generations of trembling fingers. The cross, still hanging. But even the cross felt different now. No longer a symbol of sacrifice, a warning. The kind of warning you don't read in scripture, the kind you feel in your bones when the world tilts and something long buried begins to breathe again. Ezekiel placed a hand on Phillips's shoulder. Now you speak. Phillips looked up. To who? Ezekiel didn't answer. He didn't need to. Because it was already happening. Phillips felt the memory moving through him. The truth carried by the Whitman twins. The pain of the Morrison girls. The weight of every child silenced, every lie sanctified. He stood, faced the empty pews, and began to speak, not as a pastor, but as a witness. To those who still build churches atop unmarked graves, know this. Memory is not dead. It's descending. Outside, the sky had dimmed, though it was still midday. That strange half-light blanketed Pine Hollow like a veil pulled between worlds, as if something ancient had risen just high enough to eclipse belief itself. Pastor Phillips stood at the church doorway, staring out into a town that suddenly felt borrowed. Behind him, the sanctuary echoed with silence that wasn't empty. It was listening. He turned to Ezekiel. What do we do with the others? The ones who've left? No, Phillips said, eyes narrowing. The other towns. Ezekiel's lips tightened, because the real question had finally been asked. The truth wasn't confined to Pine Hollow. This had never been about one church, one tragedy, one pair of twins. This was a template, a repeating ritual stretched across counties, centuries, civilizations. Memory doesn't rot, Ezekiel said. It waits. And when one vessel spills, it seeks the next. Phillips closed the church door behind them, locked it, not to seal anything in, but to mark the ground, a silent signal to those who would one day pass by. Something was remembered here, and something was released. They stepped into the street, empty, dust on windows, curtains that twitched and fell still again. Pine Hollow had been cracked open, its marrow spilled into the earth. But they weren't alone. On the far side of the square, beneath the skeletal remains of the old elm, stood a boy, no more than 7, dirty clothes, hollow eyes. He didn't speak, didn't move, just watched. Rachel's voice echoed in Phillips's head again. But now, it wasn't warning. It was invocation. If you've seen what must not be seen, you are now part of the witness chain. Speak or become. The boy turned, walked into the woods. Gone. Phillips understood. It had begun again. He turned to Ezekiel. The man's eyes were already on the horizon. Where next? Phillips asked. Ezekiel didn't look at him when he answered. Wherever silence has made the loudest promises, wherever graves are unmarked, but watched, wherever twins are born, with too much knowing in their eyes. Phillips nodded once, then followed. The road out of Pine Hollow was little more than a scar, a winding trail through woods that seemed older than time itself. As Phillips and Ezekiel walked, the world around them felt increasingly aware, not alive in the way of animals or trees, but like a system, recently awakened, watching, waiting. And then the rain began, not gentle, not cleansing, but remembering. Each drop struck like a whisper. Do you remember? Do you remember? They walked in silence for miles, until they reached a broken mile marker, weathered, moss-covered, half-buried in the mud. It once read, Green Parish, 9 miles. Now it simply said, Be still. Phillips paused. Another town? Ezekiel nodded, slow and grim. Worse. Because Green Parish wasn't forgotten. It was known. Whispers of the parish with no bells. A town where every child under 12 stopped speaking for 5 years. Where churches had windows bricked from the inside. Where a cathedral burned, yet no smoke rose, and no one died. Or so the story went. As they entered the forest edge, the air shifted again. Colder, not temperature, permission. As if they had been invited. Ezekiel finally spoke. The witness chain doesn't just pass through blood, it passes through denial. The more a town forgets, the closer it stands to the mirror. Phillips understood. That was the real engine behind the events in Pine Hollow. Not spirits, not visions, but the physics of repression. Every lie created a ripple, every cover-up a pressure, and eventually, the mind of the place cracked, revealing what had always been there. Green Parish had been cracking for years. As they stepped into its borders, the sound of the rain stopped. Not because it ended, because it was forbidden. Phillips looked up. Clouds hovered low, dense and dark, like lungs holding back a scream. The first building they saw was a school, abandoned, but not decayed. Chalk still on the board, desks still arranged. A child's coat hanging, dry and unstained, on a wooden peg. Phillips stepped inside. He walked to the board. There, written in perfect cursive, we kept their mouths shut, but not their minds. Ezekiel stared at the writing. They've already begun, he whispered. Phillips turned to him. Then, what do we do? Ezekiel met his gaze. Exactly what they're afraid of. We listen. They moved deeper into Green Parish, where streets bore no names and every house had its curtains drawn, not out of modesty but fear of being seen back. The silence wasn't natural. It was enforced. As if every living thing had signed an unspoken pact. Speak nothing, reveal nothing, and maybe the past won't come clawing through the walls. But the walls here already had cracks. The deeper they went, the more obvious it became. Symbols carved into thresholds, charcoal markings above doorframes, old rituals disguised as folk art. And then, on the side of what used to be the town hall, words painted in ash. Their eyes never close. Phillips looked at Ezekiel. What did they bury here? Ezekiel didn't respond. Instead, he stepped toward a statue in the town square, weather-worn and overgrown but still standing. It depicted a woman holding two children by the hand, but her face had been chiseled off, and the plaque at its base read, "Mother of those who carried memory." Suddenly, a rustle. From behind the statue, a girl emerged. 10 years old, maybe. Mud-streaked dress, hair braided in twin coils, but her eyes, unblinking. She didn't speak, just held out her hand. In it, a piece of yellowed paper, torn from something older. Phillips took it. One sentence, written in a child's shaky scrawl. "We hear what the grown-ups forget." The girl turned and walked away, not scared, not hurried, as if she knew they wouldn't stop her, as if she wasn't alone. Phillips looked to Ezekiel, voice low. "There are more, aren't there?" Ezekiel nodded. "This town breeds them, like antibodies. Every time they tried to silence the past, a child remembered too much. That's the pattern, the punishment. Not from God, from the system itself." Phillips swallowed. The entire theology he had built his life upon felt like kindling, and something had lit the match. They reached the church, boarded shut, blackened from fire, but somehow still intact. Ezekiel ran his fingers over the door, then looked back at Phillips. "Say the phrase." Phillips hesitated, then whispered, "We hear what the grown-ups forget." The door opened on its own. Inside, the scent of ash and memory hit them like a wave, and something began whispering their names. One by one, inside the burned church, the walls breathed. Not metaphorically, literally. The soot-stained wood inhaled and exhaled with a rhythm that felt ritualistic, like the structure itself was alive, not built to house worship, but to contain something older than worship, something that remembered what came before prayer and after obedience. The whispering continued. Phillips, Ezekiel, but not just their names. Samuel, Miriam, Joseph, Eliza. A roll call of forgotten witnesses. Not martyrs, not saints. Watchers who spoke too loud or too early. On the floor lay charred hymnals, but one, untouched by flame, sat open on the pulpit. Phillips approached. The page wasn't music. It was confession. Lines written in a frantic, repetitive hand, not in ink, but something darker. Blood? No, thicker. Memory turned physical. It read, "We tried to erase them, but they etched themselves into our children. The more we buried, the more they knew. The more we punished, the clearer they saw. They do not learn, they remember." Suddenly, a sound above, soft, almost childlike, a lullaby. Phillips turned his eyes toward the rafters. In the beams, hanging by their hands and feet, were dolls. Dozens, each hand-sewn, each with a blindfold, each stitched with a name. Rachel, Rebecca, Hope, Faith, Miriam, Eva, Ruth, twins. All of them. Phillips stumbled backward. The weight of it crashed through him. Green Parish wasn't just cursed. It was a memory farm. A place where silence bred twins, vessels for systemic recall. They weren't accidents of birth. They were summoned. Bred by the inertia of buried trauma, the psychic gravity of untold stories seeking hosts. Ezekiel stood still. "This is one of the original sites," he said, eyes locked on the pulpit, where the ritual was perfected. Phillips turned, horror on his face. "What ritual?" Ezekiel looked at him, not as a friend, but as a man delivering the final dose of poison needed for rebirth. The twin severance. One child speaks, the other sees. And if both survive, the system loses control. so they made sure only one ever did. Silence followed, until, from the shadows behind the altar, two voices spoke in perfect unison. Not this time. They stepped forward, barefoot, pale, untouched by soot, though the room had burned around them. Two girls, twins, identical to the Morrison sisters in age, in size, even in stillness. But these were not Rachel and Rebecca. These were echoes, residual forms shaped by memory's refusal to die. Their hair was braided with dried flowers, their dresses stitched with symbols Phillips didn't recognize, but felt in his bones. Ancient, pre-language. Their eyes never blinked. "We are what remains," the twins said. Not in harmony, in fusion. One voice made of two throats. They walked past Ezekiel and Phillips, barefoot feet never touching ash. Their presence pushed the air aside like wind before a storm. They stood beneath the burnt cross and raised their hands. The dolls above, blindfolded, bound, began to twitch. Phillips stumbled back. "What are they doing?" Ezekiel's face had gone pale. "They're severing the severance." Because that's what the ritual had always been. Create twins. Choose the seer. Silence the other. One forgotten, one haunted. So that the system stayed balanced. Just enough memory to threaten, not enough to awaken. But here, in this moment, both voices were active, and the system was cracking. One of the girls turned to Phillips. Her voice was low, direct, not childlike. "The world has never been ruled by men in power. It has always been ruled by what men fear to remember." Then she walked to the altar, knelt, whispered something into the floorboards, and the entire church shook. From beneath the pulpit an opening appeared, not built, but released, as if the structure had been waiting for someone to say the right combination of memory. Ezekiel stepped forward, eyes wet. "Beneath every sanctuary lies its original sin," he said. "And when that sin becomes aware of itself, it calls back the ones who died knowing too much." The twins looked up, their faces now full of something ancient, terrible, and holy. "Will you go down?" they asked. Phillips hesitated. He wasn't a man anymore. He was a vessel. And this was his descent. He looked to Ezekiel. "Will we come back?" Ezekiel didn't answer. Because the question was wrong. It wasn't, "Will we come back?" It was, "Who will we be when we do?" The steps into the earth weren't carved. They were worn. As if countless feet had walked this path, generation after generation, none of them mentioned in history, none of them remembered in eulogy. Phillips and Ezekiel descended into a space older than the church above it, older perhaps than the town itself. The air changed, not just in scent, but in pressure. It pressed against the chest like guilt never confessed, like a sin you didn't know was yours, until it started whispering your name. Their lantern flickered, but there was light, faint, pulsing, organic. The chamber at the bottom was circular, domed, carved from bedrock, and on the walls were names, thousands, etched into stone, etched into bone. Many were paired, twin columns, some scratched out, some repeated, some ending in dates that had not yet happened. At the center of the room was a stone table, and upon it, a body, small, female, wrapped in ceremonial cloth, but alive, barely. Her skin shimmered with a translucent hue, her breathing shallow but steady. Her eyelids fluttered as if dreaming every dream that had ever gone unspoken. Phillips stepped forward. "Who is she?" Ezekiel's voice cracked for the first time since Pine Hollow. "The one they couldn't sever. The one who saw and spoke. She's the beginning." Phillips turned. Of what? But the voice that answered came from the girl, eyes still closed, lips unmoving. Of memory reclaiming its throne. And suddenly, the chamber shifted. Not physically, chronologically. Philip saw flickers, visions slicing through his mind like broken film. Children dragged from homes, mothers made to choose one child over another, townsfolk building churches on top of burial grounds because the screams wouldn't stop unless they worshipped over them. Every ritual, every hymn, every sermon was a transaction. We give you holiness. You give us silence. Phillips collapsed to his knees, sobbing, not from sorrow, but from the unbearable truth. The faith he had built his life upon had been constructed as a cage for memory, a weaponized amnesia. He looked up. The girl opened her eyes, and for the first time Phillips saw what the system feared most, a child who remembered everything and had survived. It's not about destroying them, she whispered. It's about making sure they can't forget again. The room pulsed, not with light, but with recognition. Phillips could feel it. The structure wasn't passive. It was aware, not haunted, remembering. The names on the walls, the twins, the girl on the table. They weren't relics of the past. They were living nodes in a system designed to correct a global imbalance. The theft of truth. Ezekiel stepped forward and touched the stone slab gently. She is the last original witness, he said, kept in stasis, preserved through rites lost to time. Why? So they wouldn't have to kill her, because her death would have echoed louder than her memory. They feared the resonance more than the truth itself. Phillips stood, hands trembling. This can't be local. This is too large, too engineered. Ezekiel turned to him, face solemn. It's not just Kentucky, not just America, not even this era. This system spans empires. Every generation has a selective memory program, a ritual to fracture reality, and call it history. Phillips looked at the sleeping girl. She opened her eyes again. Not ancient, not wise, just awake. Do you see now? She whispered. Memory isn't passive. It fights back. And at that moment, the room began to respond. The names on the walls lit up, not with fire or flame, but emotion. Grief, rage, clarity. Some of the names glowed briefly, then vanished. Truths finally witnessed. Others burned brighter. Truths yet to be spoken. Phillips turned in a slow circle, absorbing it all. Generations of silence unraveling. And then, the twins appeared in the chamber doorway. Not the glowing ones. The Morrison girls. Rachel and Rebecca. They stepped forward, no longer afraid. Rebecca spoke first. She called to us. Rachel followed. Because we're the next chain. Ezekiel knelt, tears in his eyes. They've always come in twos. One to speak, one to carry. And when both survive long enough, the illusion ends. Phillips felt it then. Something ancient, slipping. The thin veil that kept humanity blind was tearing. This wasn't about a town anymore. Not even a country. It was a war between engineered forgetting and weaponized remembering. Rachel held out her hand. Will you remember with us? Phillips, trembling, placed his hand in hers and whispered twice. Memory is rebellion. Memory is rebellion. The moment Phillips spoke those words, memory is rebellion, the chamber responded. The light dimmed, not into darkness, but into depth, as though reality itself pulled inward, forcing everyone present into the core of something unspeakably old. The names on the walls stopped glowing. Now they pulsed. A beat, a rhythm, a code. Rachel stepped onto the stone platform and laid her hand on the sleeping girl's forehead. Rebecca mirrored her, placing her palm over the girl's heart. The chamber shuddered, not from instability, but from recognition. Like a forgotten machine rebooting after centuries offline, ancient software flooding back into a system designed to forget itself. Ezekiel dropped to one knee. "She's sinking them," he whispered. "The sleeping girl. And the Morrison twins. They're closing the feedback loop." Phillips didn't understand, but something in his bones did. Across the walls, new names began etching themselves into the stone. Fresh lines carved by unseen hands, each name appearing slowly, deliberately. Samuel Turner, Elizabeth Carter, Pastor William Phillips. His own name, burned into permanence. He staggered backward. "What is this?" The girl on the slab opened her eyes one final time. "These are the confessors, the ones who were forced to forget, but now choose to remember. You're no longer a bystander. You're recorded." And then she smiled, not from joy, but from completion. A system once fractured was whole again. The dolls from the rafters in the church above began to drop one by one, each landing with a sound like a stamp on flesh. 1 per second. A rhythm. Reintegration. For every doll that dropped, another hidden memory awakened somewhere else in the world. A child dreaming of voices. A woman writing a name she's never heard. A man weeping in a field and not knowing why. The system wasn't breaking. It was awakening. The Morrison twins stepped down from the slab and took Phillips's hands. Rachel leaned in. "It's time to leave this place. The church has served its purpose. Now the witnesses must go, not to escape, to ignite." Phillips nodded. His former life, his sermons, his doctrine, his comforting illusions, all turned to ash in his soul. All that remained was this truth. He wasn't here to save memory. He was here to spread it. They emerged from the underground chamber as if surfacing from a different century. The Green Parish Church, once a hollowed-out ruin, now stood still, silent, and somehow emptier. Not abandoned, not haunted, just discharged, like a vessel that had fulfilled its terrible function and was now waiting to collapse into time. The sun had not risen, and yet light filtered across the landscape in ways it shouldn't. Not morning light, not moonlight, memory light, soft, unnatural, like the world had remembered its own trauma and was now bleeding awareness into the sky. Ezekiel walked slowly, hand pressed to his chest, each step heavy, as if he were walking with 1,000 souls tethered to him. The Morrison twins were ahead, holding hands now, speaking softly to one another, no longer burdened by secrets. And Phillips? He didn't follow. He walked with them. Because something had changed. Not just in him, in the system itself. They had passed a threshold where memory was no longer a ghost. It had become infrastructure. You could feel it in the wind, hear it in the trees, sense it in the shiver that ran down your spine for no reason at all. At the edge of town, they passed the old well, the one that had been sealed for decades. Phillips paused. He peered down. Nothing but darkness. But the twins stood beside him. Rachel whispered, "They threw them down here." Rebecca nodded. "Not bodies. Names." Phillips understood. Green Parish hadn't just been a site of physical burial. It was a spiritual oubliette, a place designed to erase identity, to delete lineage from the living archive. And now, the archive was reconnecting. Behind them, a low rumble. The church, finally, collapsed. Not violently, almost gratefully, like a prison that had lost its prisoners, like a lie that no longer had the energy to stand upright. They turned their backs on it and walked. Through the woods, past forgotten gravestones, along roads that had been hidden from maps on purpose. Phillips spoke quietly, more to himself than anyone else. "How far does this go?" Ezekiel answered without turning. "Farther than any of us want to admit. But now, it's moving forward." Because the story was no longer about two girls in 1834. It was about every system that ever tried to silence the ones who remember. By the time they reached the tree line, the sky had shifted again, but not with weather, with awareness. It hung heavy, like the moment before an army advances or the silence before a judge speaks. The world wasn't just turning, it was watching, listening, waiting to see if its forgotten children would dare speak. Ezekiel stopped at an old boundary stone, one of the original markers from when Green Parish was founded in 1791. It had always looked like just another rock. But now, etched deep into its surface, were words that hadn't been there before. Here began the silence. Here begins the memory. Rebecca ran her fingers across it, her eyes no longer wide with fear, but focused, alert. She didn't look like a little girl. She looked like a messenger. Rachel stood beside her, whispering names again. But this time, names no one else had spoken aloud in over a century. Phillips asked, "Where are we going now?" Ezekiel turned, and for the first time, smiled, not from joy, but from understanding. To the next fracture, to the next site where memory was bled out and buried under doctrine. This isn't the end of anything. It's the reawakening of everything. Phillips felt something tug inside him, like a door opening in his chest, like permission. His dreams, the strange ones he'd had since childhood, the visions, the voices, they weren't imagination. They weren't madness. They were inheritance. And the system had known. It had always known. That's why it made him a pastor, a recorder, a man trained to shape narratives and suppress inconvenient truths. But now, he would use those same tools to rebuild the archive, the real one. The girls began to walk again, toward the west, toward the places that had gone quiet too long. Ezekiel followed. Phillips looked back just once, toward the ruins of Green Parish. But there were no ruins anymore, only a field of white lilies growing where the floor once stood, flowers that hadn't bloomed in this part of Kentucky for over 100 years. He didn't speak. He simply nodded, because some things don't need to be said to be remembered. They traveled without maps. No compass, no signs, no roads, only pull. A gravitational memory stitched into the marrow of those who could still feel it. By the second day, the Morrison twins began humming again. Not songs, frequencies, tones that moved through the trees like a code, awakening old stones, cracked walls, forgotten places that had once held rituals too dark for scripture. They passed an abandoned mission in southern Ohio. The stones blackened, the bell tower crumbled, but as they crossed its threshold, the air shifted. Rebecca whispered, "This is where they silenced the seers." Rachel touched the wall and murmured a name no history book contained. The moss peeled back, revealing a face carved in stone, weeping, blindfolded. Another recording station, another site where the memory economy had extracted vision and replaced it with dogma. Phillips took notes in silence, but not with pen and paper. He was remembering differently now, not storing facts, storing vibration. Ezekiel called it the resonance archive. "Every man carries one," he explained. "Most just forget how to play it." They camped that night beneath a sky so clear it felt wrong, too honest, too revealing. Phillips lay awake, staring upward. And then it began. The dreams, the ones not his own. He saw a cathedral in Prague where a child had been sealed behind the altar in 1403 to protect a prophecy too dangerous to fulfill. A plantation in South Carolina where enslaved twins whispered in an unknown tongue and made their overseer vanish overnight. A Soviet research station in 1961 where two young sisters sketched maps of American missile sites they'd never seen. Each location, each era, the same pattern. Twins, dreams, revelations, erasure. Phillips woke in a cold sweat, but Rachel was sitting beside him. She wasn't frightened. She was watching, hating. She handed him a small stone, perfectly smooth, shaped like an eye. "You're remembering because it's your turn now," she said. "They won't stop you this time. You've already crossed the line where forgetting becomes impossible." Phillips gripped the stone. He didn't ask what it meant. He knew, by the time they reached the outskirts of Ashford County, the sky had changed again, but not in color, in texture. Clouds moved unnaturally, not like weather, but like curtains. Thin veils hiding something massive just behind perception, waiting for permission to be seen. Ezekiel paused on the ridge. Below them, a field where nothing had grown since 1871. Locals called it the ash field. No soil samples, no chemicals, no farming attempts had ever worked there. Everything planted simply vanished. Rachel closed her eyes. "There's something buried here that isn't physical," Rebecca whispered. "A memory so heavy, the ground can't breathe." Phillips stepped forward, compelled. He reached into his satchel and pulled out the stone the girls had given him. It began to vibrate, not from any force, but from recognition. He knelt and pressed the stone into the dirt. Nothing happened at first. Then the ground sighed, not a quake, not a crack, but a release. As if the earth itself had been holding its breath for over a century, afraid to exhale the truth buried beneath its surface. And then, visions, not dreams, not hallucinations, downloads. He saw the Ashford twins, 1834, buried alive under orders of a secret religious tribunal. Their crime? Reciting the names of future presidents before the age of 7, all of them accurate, including one who had not yet been born. The tribunal panicked. It wasn't prophecy. It was exposure. The twins weren't predicting the future. They were revealing the script. Phillips staggered back, eyes wide. He wasn't just watching history unfold. He was inside the memory loop. Every suppressed twin case, every silenced seer, every coincidence across centuries was scripted. Manufactured anomalies, controlled bursts of disclosure to test the system's limits. And now, the system had lost control. Ezekiel whispered, read, almost reverently. This is what they feared most. That memory would stop being personal and start becoming contagious. The stone in the ground cracked, and beneath it, bones, small, fragile, twins, but not decayed, preserved, eyes open, still reflecting a future not yet born. Phillips fell to his knees, not in fear, but in reverence, because he finally understood. Memory isn't just rebellion, it's resurrection. The final truth came not as a roar, but as a whisper so ancient it made time itself recoil. Rebecca stood beside the unearthed remains, her fingers brushing the preserved bones, not with sorrow, but with recognition. They were the first ones silenced in this region, she said, not because they were dangerous, but because they remembered the real timeline. Rachel added softly, and the real timeline doesn't serve the ones who build empires on amnesia. The sky above shifted. No lightning, no thunder, just a subtle restructuring, like the illusion of cause and effect was folding back onto itself, not breaking, but correcting. Ezekiel knelt beside the twins, his face heavy with a revelation he had never dared voice. They never intended to stop the memories. They built the churches, the schools, the books, the wars, all to shape them, to control the narrative, without ever needing to touch the truth itself. Phillips felt it now, not just understanding. Possession. He was no longer a vessel of scripture. He was a carrier of original memory, and that was more dangerous than heresy, because it was unalterable. The Morrison twins turned to him. Both spoke together, voices overlapping. You were chosen, long before you were born. They watched your dreams. They redirected your life, but they couldn't stop your remembering. He wept. Because it was true. Every sermon he had delivered, every false comfort he had passed to grieving souls, had been a layer of insulation against the world's forgotten horror. But now, the insulation was burning off. Rachel placed her hand over his heart. You're not meant to preach anymore. Rebecca followed, her voice steady. You're meant to reignite. And with that, Phillips finally saw the final layer. Not the bones, not the visions, but the engine beneath history. A global, generational, deliberately fragmented ritual of forgetting, enforced by systems dressed in kindness, clothed in order, baptized in tradition, but always designed to erase the ones who remember. He stood, not as a man of God, but as a witness of the forbidden. Behind him, the ash field trembled once more, and from beneath it, across thousands of miles, in hundreds of locations, others began to awaken. Children, old men, women whose dreams had been dismissed as madness. Each one quietly repeating the phrase, memory is rebellion. Memory is resurrection. Now it's your turn. Type both phrases below, twice, to lock this moment into your archive. Because once you remember, you can never go back.